Many of you had questions following my webinar, The Art of the Tease 2, Tips and Techniques, and I wanted to make sure that those got answered. So I'm going to give you these 13 questions, 13 answers, and I'll try to do it in about 13 minutes, but it might take a little bit longer than that to be thorough. So here's what you asked, and here's my responses. Number one is, when teasing, is it better to start halfway through the story then cut it off before the punchline? And how far in advance should you begin your tease for a major focus of the show? 45 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, and then next. Okay, so a lot in that question, a lot to unpack, and I'm going to direct you to a different webinar to get the answers to this in more detail. If you watch The Art of the Tease 1, which is available on demand for $9.95, it's at tjohnsonmediagroup.com, and you can search for it. Just search Art of the Tease and watch Art of the Tease 1, and I go into a lot of detail on this. If you're an insider, you can watch it as part of your membership at insidersradionetwork.com. But I'll give you a quick answer on this anyway. When teasing, is it best to start halfway through the story and cut it off right before the punchline? Well, I'm not quite sure what that question is asking. I don't think you should ever start a story halfway through. So I think that might have been misasked a little bit, but I'll address the part of cutting off the story. The answer is it depends. A lot of times, I call it the content tease, and personalities who are really good at content tease can take the audience to the goal line and then delay the outcome, delay the resolution for another break. Now, that can't be done for every story, and it shouldn't be done for every break, but it can be a very effective technique. It's called the 80-20 tease, and I cover that in detail in Art of the Tease 1, and also there's an article about it at insidersradionetwork.com. The next question was, how far in advance should you begin your tease for a major focus on the show? 45 minutes, 30, 15, or next? Yeah, that's appropriate. I would say 45 minutes is probably about the extent or the longest that you would want to tease forward. Then 30 minutes, 15 minutes, and next. That makes sense. And that comes down to timing the tease. And there's a whole strategy for timing the tease. And again, I cover that in Art of the Tease 1. It wasn't in Art of the Tease 2. It's why I broke it up into two different sessions. Next question is, how often should you tease on the air? And what are some of the best teases to hold the listener's attention? Do you tease going into every break? I think that it's almost impossible to tease too much, as long as you're teasing properly. And what do I mean by teasing properly? Number one is you don't want to be vague or generic. Just doing vague, generic teases is a waste of time and should never be on the air. But if you have a well-prepared tease and it's not hype, and there's a difference between teases that are effective and are acting as a roadmap for the audience and calling attention to something the audience is going to respond positively to. There's a difference between that and clickbait, audio version of clickbait, which we cover in the Art of the Tease 2 seminar. So how often do you tease? I think you should tease all the time. One of the points in the seminar is that you should tease in every single break. Virtually every time you turn on the microphone, there should be a tease where you're giving the audience something to look forward to, a chance to increase your time spent listening and create another appointment. What are the best teases to hold the listener's attention? Watch the seminar, watch the webinar. We go into a lot of detail on that. And the most effective teases that hold listener attention is going to vary greatly depending on the individual personality. Some personalities are better at one particular type of tease than another. That's what you should specialize in. It's not what you should do exclusively, but you should specialize in it. Next question is, what's the most important thing that a tease is supposed to contain? The most important thing you can do in a tease is to create curiosity and the fear of missing out. You appeal to the audience that there's something coming up that they're going to like and they're going to be afraid to miss out on it. Now, make sure that the tease that you deliver is not clickbait, like I mentioned before, but that the content that you're delivering is worthy of the tease. And if you're constructing your tease in a way that is calling attention to the hook of the segment of the story, then you're going to have a lot of success with that. So point to the hook of the upcoming segment and make sure that it's truly compelling and it's an outside-in tease, like we covered in the seminar. Can you explain the difference between how to execute a big tease and a small tease? And the examples are coming up today, later on, like a big tease, what's worthy of that, and what's coming up next, something that's smaller. Well, the rule of thumb, again, this is covered in Art of the Tease 1, the theory and philosophy, but the rule of thumb is that the more available your audience is, the more promotable your content is. So if you have whatever's coming up in the next 5 minutes is very promotable because most of your audience is going to be available in the next 5 minutes. It just kind of makes sense, right? So you can promote more often to what's coming up next than what's coming up 45 minutes or an hour from now. So by extension, if you promote something that's coming up much later in the show, it has to be much more significant, much more important. The further out it is, the less available the audience is. The less available the audience is, the more important the tease and the content needs to be. How about sharing the tease with multiple partners on the show? This can be done if you've got a multicast show. I covered this when I talk about the stacking of teases, that if you have different teases in the same break, then it can be really effective to change voices there and have different partners deliver a separate tease. It helps the audience sort out all of the content. But if you are creating a tease and the partners on the show are commenting on it or sharing it or having a conversation about it, that can be effective, but it gets tricky. Because a lot of times that tease then turns into performance of the actual break, or the tease ends up getting to be extended. It gets to be a little bit too long. I've heard that work really effectively, and I've got some examples of how that works effectively. I chose not to put it in the seminar because I don't think it's a best practice for most shows to do, for the reasons that I pointed out. On question teases, if the listener's answer is no, or if they can't quickly figure out the answer, isn't that bad? Yes, that is bad. That's why you have to be very clever about how you construct your question teases. Question teases should never be yes or no. In fact, you should never ask a yes or no question on the radio ever. Instead of saying, has this ever happened to you? You should change that to, when's the last time this happened to you or someone you know? Or you should turn that into more of a statement that the listener can either agree with or disagree with, but isn't a no. Because as the question points out, if it's a question tease and the listener's answer is no, they mentally tune out as soon as that's over. So yes, that would be bad if you ask a yes-no question in a question tease. I hear stations running sweepers going into stop sets all the time that say coming up next. Is that asking for tune out? Yes, it is asking for tune out. For several reasons. Number one is it's a vague tease. It's vague and it's generic. Saying we've got more music coming up next is kind of taken for granted. It isn't informing the audience of anything because they're listening to the station because you're playing music. So to just say we've got more music coming up after this does nothing to position your radio station, and it is inviting listeners to tune out because you've basically just advertised commercials. Rather than do that, I would recommend creating a hook that is compelling for something that's coming up in the relatively near future. Maybe that's some information about a song. It's a great opportunity to what I call Casey Kaseming it. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, Casey Kasem was one of the great teasers of all time by using content to make listeners care about something that they generally don't care about. You can read about that on my website at tjohnsonmediagroup.com and do a search for Casey Kasem. He is a tease master. He got listeners invested in his content that really wasn't all that significant, but it was the way that he constructed the content. And I think you can do a lot of that going into stop sets, and especially when you're promoting music coming up on the other side. Can a tease be too long? Well, I kind of covered this a little bit ago in talking about partner teases, but yes, teases can be too long. I apply the same rule of thumb to teases as I do any other content on the air. Content should always be as long as it needs to be effective and no longer. And it should be as short as it can be to get the point across, but no shorter. So how long should a tease be? Well, there's no answer to that. As long as it's compelling, as long as it's interesting, and as long as it takes to get the audience interested. Most of the time on most radio shows, I hear teases that are too short, not long enough to really get the audience interested. And therefore, that 5 or 6 or 7 second tease is a waste of 5 or 6 or 7 seconds. And that's a crime. Listeners don't have any patience for that. But I've heard 15, 20, 30 second teases that are just fine. They're not too long because they're compelling, they're interesting, and they get me excited about what's coming up. I noticed that in the examples you gave in the seminar that you didn't timestamp anything, but said things like in 2 minutes. Is this more effective than giving a specific time? Well, this gets into the whole philosophy and theory of timing the tease, and both techniques are effective, and you should apply both of those techniques depending upon how far out the content is. In the workshop that I did in the seminar, I tended to keep it all about the same because I wanted to have the respondents focusing more on the teases that were created and not on the mechanics of the timing of the tease. That wasn't really a point of that, but I cover it in detail in The Art of the Tease 1, the theory and philosophy. And I give you the theory and the philosophy of when you should tease. It's coming up in 2 minutes or in 4 minutes or in 6 minutes, or when you should timestamp it at a specific time and how to do that, or when to set the appointment by giving the actual time. Tell me how to tease without making it feel like clickbait. It only becomes clickbait when the content that you deliver is not equal to or greater than the promise that you make in the tease. All right? Does that make sense? I mean, you've all felt like you were victimized by clickbait online, or you see a sign on the side of a freeway that looks like that restaurant at the next exit is going to be fantastic, and it's not. Well, that's where the advertising is greater than the product. And I think the same thing applies to what you tease on the air. So don't be afraid to embellish, to exaggerate, and to enhance the tease, to dress it up, to put some showbiz into it. But don't hype it to the point where the payoff isn't worth the promise. Do you tease when you're going into the next break 15 minutes later? And what does that sound like? Yes, you do. Some personalities only talk 4 times an hour, especially outside of the morning show or afternoon show, and you only have 4 opportunities to talk, and sometimes it can be 10 or 15 minutes before that comes up. And there's different techniques for that. Again, we cover that all in the Art of the Tease 1. Thanks for the workshop, Tracy. Do you recommend that personalities avoid saying coming up after this break? Instead, should they say coming up in 5 minutes since commercials are a turnoff? Yes, that's one of the main points in the workshop, in the seminar. I hear so many times a personality says something like coming up after this, or when we get back, or we're late for a break, or we've got to take this break, but when we come back. And all that does to a listener is invites them to go search something else. Now, when the commercials come on, they kind of get that point anyway, and they're looking for something else if they're available. But we don't have to call attention to it, because to say when we come back, it implies we're going away. And if you're going away, why wouldn't I want to go away? So we're pointing out something bad. It's a waste of a couple of seconds, and it may not be a major crime, but why say that? There's no point in saying that. Instead, you should always be positive and always be building forward momentum. And the last question is, how do I hold my audience for a long period of time to keep them interested in the content that's coming up through my tease? All right, so I'll paraphrase that a little bit. How do I create a tease that's going to hold my audience for a long period of time or get them to come back? Well, the answer is you can't. Most of the reasons that listeners tune out is because either they're bored, they're confused, you've changed what's on the air. Every time that we transition from one type of content to another, it's an invitation to tune out, or life gets in the way. and they're no longer available to listen. For example, if they get to work and they get out of their car and they don't turn on the radio when they get inside work, there's nothing you can do to get them back. So I advise personalities not to worry about tune out, because tune out is going to happen. There's nothing you can do about tune out. You cannot eliminate tune out. Maybe we can minimize tune out to an extent, but we can't eliminate it. So don't worry so much about tune out. Instead, worry about what you're going to be doing to get the audience to remember to tune back in. And that's really the key to a tease. How do we get them to remember? How do we do something that's important enough and call attention to something that would get them to remember to come back to us shortly into the future, even if it's a little bit longer into the future? So there's the questions and answers. I hope that helps you. If you have any more, you can always email me. My email address is tracy@tjohnsonmediagroup.com. And you can watch The Art of the Tease 2 on demand. And I would also recommend watching The Art of the Tease 1 on demand. Insiders can get both of the seminars at insidersradionetwork.com as part of your membership. And if you're not an insider, you can watch it on demand for $9.95 at tjohnsonmediagroup.com. Thank you.